And we are live. It is Thursday, October 5th, 9:01 p.m. as I am recording this episode. Welcome to Film School Dropout. My name is Ben Friedman, film critic. You notice I'm a little low energy today. I meant to record this podcast one way earlier. Scheduling just kind of got in the way with trying to get a guest. I didn't want to delay this series specifically for a title like Boxcar Bertha. So I was like, you know what? This is going to be the one that I do a solo pod on. That's fine. I don't mind doing it. I had it all laid out to record today. And I wake up this morning pretty sick out of my mind. I'm just not feeling well. And there was kind of a question of, do I cancel this episode? Do I just kind of just erase it and just come back to Boxcar Bertha later? I started feeling a little bit more up to it as the day went along. I can't say I'm in particularly high spirits right now, but I'm at least here and present enough. So I apologize because this episode may be a little low energy, but I'm going to try to keep the conversation at the very least still insightful as I discuss Boxcar Bertha, which is Martin Scorsese's second feature film. This released in, I believe the year was 1972. And Boxcar Bertha is this really interesting film in his career because it's kind of an exploitation film. It's directed by, not directed by, it is produced by Roger Corman, who, if you don't know him, he's the Pope of pop cinema, the king of cult, etc., etc. You know, he works with all these directors. He's known for projects such as The Little Shop of Horrors, the Wild Angels, The Trip, A Bucket of Blood, all of these movies, as well as taking minor acting roles throughout. Apologies, but so it's produced by Roger Corman, with screenplay by Joyce H. Corrington and John William Corrigan, directed by Scorsese himself in 1972. It follows Boxcar Bertha Thompson, who is a poor Southern girl, orphaned and living in her father's crop dusting airplane. Jesus, let me repeat this. And I'm not doing editing, and I'm sorry, I'm reading my notes on the fly, which isn't great. But she's this poor Southern girl, orphaned, and then she goes on this trip throughout the Great Depression. And it's kind of this almost I would almost call it a spiritual successor of Bonnie and Clyde. It has the same type of energy. You could really tell that Corman's note to Scorsese was, make me a exploitation film in the style of Bonnie and Clyde, and that's essentially what Scorsese delivers. This stars Barbara Hershey as Boxcar Bertha, David Carradine's in this movie, Barry Primus, Bernie Casey. Barbara Hershey, I should just note, ends up playing Mother Mary in his Last Temptation of Christ, so she does end up working again with Scorsese. So released in 1972, the last film that he makes pre Mean Streets. So this is really his first foray into the studio system. And again, not necessarily the studio system that we know, but certainly a popular enough studio system. He's making kind of a low budget thriller, romantic drama, road movie, I guess is probably the best way to describe it, made on a $600,000 budget. And it is an interesting film to watch in the context of Scorsese, knowing what Scorsese becomes. If we're just being completely downright honest with each other, Boxcar Bertha, there isn't much to really discuss in this movie. It's an entertaining enough movie. I actually like this movie enough. I think Barbara Hershey in particular is really good in this role, and I think there is a lot of fun to be had with here, especially with the exploitation nature of this movie. The violence in this movie is pretty pulpy fun, kind of in a way that Tarantino and Oliver Stone will be doing in the 1990s along with Robert Rodriguez. It has that type of early cult status movies that Tarantino always talks about in his biographies and in his interviews. I'm sure he's watched Boxcar Bertha. It has that kind of same style, and it does have a very distinct style where Who's That Knocking at My Door is a director first coming to their own. Boxcar Bertha is Scorsese feeling a little bit more comfortable with his style and with his just ability to play. And there's a lot of interesting anecdotes about this movie. And again, apologies because I keep saying interesting. It's just my brain's not able to compound other words today. But so let's just start with some of the background history of it. They get Barbara Hershey in this movie. Roger Corman, wanting this movie to be an exploitation movie, insists on nudity every few minutes. Scorsese fights back. From my understanding, it doesn't sound like he particularly liked the idea of having this be an exploitation film and exploiting Hershey's body for this. There's kind of this compromise where this movie does have a few just random nude scenes throughout. Barbara Hershey is a very beautiful woman. These scenes are definitely not necessarily the most explicit that we've ever seen in these types of movies. They're also completely non-integral to the plot of this movie. It's very much just clearly a studio note from Corman saying that we need to get young boys into the audience, and they succeeded enough about that. This movie grossed $1.1 million on a $600,000 budget, which not bad for the time, and gives Scorsese a little bit more gives him a little bit more credibility as the years go on, allowing him to make Mean Streets. And there's all these scenes that I could be talking about in the movie. You definitely see the scenery of the American South and a little bit of the American West, if I recall, by the end. But it is kind of like this. I'm trying to remember. There was this book when I was a kid. I think it was called The Boxcar Kids, right? I'm typing it in. The Boxcar Children. And this was just because this franchise was so in my head when I was a kid. Like, I was very aware of this series. But Boxcar Bertha does kind of have that same thing where it's just going through the American South. And they're doing the fried hopping, going through as the Great Depression. This movie is one, I would say, interesting to note because of its actual focus on unions. This movie is basically she meets this person played by David Carradine named Big Bill Shelley. I'm trying, guys. I'm really trying here. And it's he's a union organizer, which is this theme that Scorsese has always returned to. A lot of his movies have unions in the background. And they go along this trip. You have the railway boss played by, I'm trying to think of the name of the actor. It's not coming to me. And they become fugitives of the law. In the process, you have one of their friends played by Barry Primus, Rick Brown in the movie. He's gunned down. And Bill and Vaughn are sent to a chain gang. Vaughn being played by Bernie Casey. This leads to Bertha escaping, and she's lured into this life of prostitution. I'm just going beat by beat kind of for this movie to get more to the interesting part of this conversation. Before they can leave, Vaughn appears, wipes out the henchman, and releases Bertha from bondage. Very interesting thing to note about this movie is it definitely plays for like the first half of the movie that the character doing the kind of violence of this movie is going to be heavily Boxcar Bertha, Barbara Hershey's character. That doesn't really end up being what the film turns out to be. For the first half, she is this kind of impressive heroine, and then as the film goes along, she kind of gets not even lost in this film, but just kind of has to take a sidestep to the men in this movie in a way that just didn't really suit the film in any meaningful way. The issue is this movie, you care so much about Hershey's great performance in this movie, and I will say she gives a really good performance as Boxcar Bertha in this movie. It's just as it goes along, they lose focus and narrative of her, and it just doesn't work anywhere near as well. I want to note this movie, and why I would recommend seeing it is, one, because it does have unique camera movements. There's scenes with the action, there's ways the trains are shot. You can just feel Scorsese becoming more and more of his own. Like, it is just a director where you're like, he doesn't have all the tools necessary to make a great movie yet, but he certainly is showing a vast improvement from Who's That Knocking at My Door to Boxcar Bertha, where you're just like, oh, okay, it's now been about 5 years and he's learned quite a bit more, and he's a lot more comfortable in it. And he's now starting to work in the studio system in Hollywood, which ends up being kind of where he makes his bread and butter in the 1970s, where he breaks in a big way with Mean Streets and Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, and of course eventually Taxi Driver. So that's an exciting element of this movie that I can recommend, is just seeing someone that we consider an old master right now come into his element. It's actually kind of inspirational, because you're like, oh, Scorsese didn't always start off as Scorsese as we know him. He had to make kind of cheap, low-rate B movies and just kind of become a director for hire there. He'd, fight for his actors, but also be a director of exploitation, which is essentially what this movie is. So that element of Scorsese's career is interesting, because it's just like, oh, okay, this is the development and evolution of a director working into becoming the director that we know, which really starts formulating with his next film, Mean Streets. And the reason Mean Streets gets made is essentially Martin Scorsese, is told by one of his friends, and I'm trying to remember which friend it is, but one of his friends, who's a critic, basically just tells Scorsese, you should stop making these types of films. Like, you're not happy. These aren't your bread and butter. Like, it's just not really working for you, and you're going to be miserable, and you can't make films like this. I'm trying to find the name of the critic who told off Scorsese for this, but it gives Scorsese basically the chance to just realize, like, oh, okay, I need to kind of move on from this. And that allows him to make Mean Streets. Mean Streets is I don't know if Mean Streets happens without him making Boxcar Bertha and not really being able to make the film. Here it is. He screens it for John Cassavetes, and who's an actor, director, writer. You guys know him probably best from Rosemary's Baby, A Woman Under the Influence. He's the director of that. So here's the anecdote. After seeing it, hugged Scorsese and said, Marty, you just made a... Sorry, let me repeat that. He hugged Scorsese and said, Marty, you just spent a whole year of your life making a piece of shit. It's a good picture, but you're better than the people who make this kind of movie. Don't get hooked into the exploitation market. Just try and do something different. As a result, Scorsese's next film was Mean Streets. So this film has to come in because John Cassavetes has to give Scorsese probably the most important advice he will get. But there's also just some other elements of the 1970s that we learn from here. Barbara Hershey later talked about this, and she says that was a lot of fun getting to work with Scorsese, how well Scorsese treated her. She took issue with Corman's behavior. A lot of fun, even though it's terribly crippled by Roger Corman and the violence and sex. But between the actors and Martin Scorsese, the director, we had a lot of fun. We really had characters down, but ones tend to not see all because you end up seeing all the blood and sex. Basically, again, kind of taking issue with Corman's direction of this and basically wanted to make an exploitation movie. This is also, I'm just trying to find any other notes that I want to talk about here. But I don't think, there's not really in it. Scorsese does have a cameo in this movie. That's all I'm really going to say about Boxcar Bertha. One, because I'm largely starting to get to the feeling where I'm going to throw up soon if I keep talking uninterrupted. I don't know if you've noticed, I'm not editing this episode just solely so I don't have to go back and deal with this in post. I just kind of wanted to do it one time only, and go from there. And just, I think I just realized my microphone is actually on my Mac speakers, not this guy, so I do apologize for the audio. This is where the brain's just turned off. But I'll just give a quick anecdote about my relationship with Scorsese as a filmmaker, which I've given it slightly on this podcast before, but I really want to go into it more. But just so Martin Scorsese, he's this director that I studied a lot in college. For those who do not know, I was a history major in college, focused on 20th century American society and culture, mainly because I loved movies, and I focused a lot on Scorsese because I focus on the period post Kennedy's assassination to basically 9/11. That was my 50 years of work that I really stayed focused in. And Scorsese's a big part because of the John Hinckley Jr. President Reagan presidential assassination attempt, all that. So I really wanted to just dive into him, understand his work. So I think the film that I watched most in college was The King of Comedy because I did this thesis paper on it. The thesis paper basically being that, and for those who do not know it, I'll just kind of re-air it right now. John Hinckley Jr. was kind of let off the hook to some degree by mass media, where they're like, the reason he shot President Reagan is because and get ready for this because this is wild, he was inspired by Taxi Driver. Thus, he is in charge of this, he is responsible for this, but we also need to place a fair amount of blame on Taxi Driver. And Taxi Driver, this is one of the wildest facts you'll ever learn, Taxi Driver was screened in its fullest for the jury during the Hinckley trial. Hinckley basically has a mental breakdown when the movie's watching. Sounds like a lot of it was faked. He was prepped a lot by his lawyers. That's kind of the evidence that we at least have supporting it. Years later, and essentially Taxi Driver takes this hit, and King of Comedy is the response to that. The whole point of my paper was I was studying about it where it's just so, and I find this really just fascinating, is President Reagan is shot, and John Hinckley Jr. moves to California in 1975, early 1976. He's obviously clearly mentally unwell. He has been detached from his mother, who's the only person that really ever showed him love, father abusive, goes to college in Texas, doesn't really have a life for himself. Weird, quiet kid, takes a fascination in Hitler and Nazism, which is obviously a red flag, starts getting really invested in guns. Really, all the warning signs are appearing. Goes to California, sees Taxi Driver there. He's exploiting his parents to send them money, basically saying that he's made it in the music career, even though he never did, and he just needs money to kind of get it all off the ground. But he's with this producer who's going to make him big. He's completely lying this whole time. There is no relationship. There is no producer. He ends up coming home a few months later, but it's post seeing Taxi Driver. It is probably believed, and it's at the very least speculated, or as I did so, speculated that he probably saw Taxi Driver for the first time in New York. John Hinckley Jr. then goes on. He tries to assassinate, I want to say it's President Gerald Ford, and it doesn't actually go really anywhere. FBI is now kind of aware of him. Reagan incident happens, but while living in California in the 1970s, it is really important to note, when Reagan was governor of California, what did he do? He cut mental health spending. So John Hinckley Jr. is going to a therapist at this time. Therapist kind of just says oh, he's a guy who's depressed and just kind of needs a woman in his life. There's not really much else to him. He's not really of any danger. Kind of just speaks of the quality of mental health care in our country at that time, and a system that is still pretty broken. That's why I studied Scorsese, just to think of the ramifications of basically a director being blamed for their piece of art and saying that is the reason society is fucked up. We see that argument all the time. I mean, if you think of post-Columbine, that happens with The Matrix and with video games, and it's just Marilyn Manson, which I'm not really going to spend time defending Manson on this show, but that is what ends up happening. We see that, and it's just oh, the violent imagery on TV and movies, that is to blame. And then you have all these other ones where it's just oh, our vigilante storytelling's the reason the shooting happened at Aurora, or just all these other events where it's just people become obsessed, where it's just oh, they saw this one violent thing once, and thus that is what broke them and made them act out in a very violent way. The argument, of course, against that is every other country in the world has violent media, and they're not having these mass shootings like America is. America is unique in its mass shooting, and for the epidemic of gun and gun culture and how much that has run amok. my theory essentially with this thesis paper was, in blaming Taxi Driver and blaming Martin Scorsese, in then large part blaming the art, you're able to kind of escape. You can escape the fact of you don't have to answer for questions of mental health treatment in America. You can escape the fascination that white men in their early 20s have with Nazism. You're able to just escape that. You're able to escape white male fragility. You're able to take blame away from guns and gun culture and how easily accessible a gun was to John Hinckley Jr., despite the fact that he was on a watch list, that like people knew he was unstable. Just this ability for John Hinckley Jr. to just be the most obvious thing that was going to happen, and yet by the times it happens, and what should have been the most this was always going to happen. Well, how do people respond? Oh, we blame Taxi Driver. Taxi Driver's at fault. And by doing that, you're able to replace blame. You're able to take Taxi Driver and make it the object and be like, this is kind of a Christ-like symbol. It is taking all of our sin for us. And the sin of American culture, the sin of gun violence, of politicians cutting mental health funding, of the Republican and Conservative Party in the 1980s, this vilification of mentally unwell people. What essentially becomes post this trial, where everyone kind of realizes like, oh, maybe John Hinckley Jr. got off a little too easy and like he used this insanity plea. Well, what ends up happening is, guess what? States, especially in the South and especially conservative states, start just abolishing all the protections that mentally unwell people have in the court system. They have to prove their insanity. They have to do all these things where it just doesn't give people with actual mental health diagnosis any proper care in the law system. And there's no actual protections for them. And in certain states, they start getting the death penalties, and southern states start bringing them back. And it's basically a way to vilify mentally ill people, which has a result. If you look at statistics, breaking this down, and again, it's been a few years, but I believe it was something like close to half of Americans have gone through their life at some point with a mental health disorder. Now, that can be just as simple as having, seasonal depression. That can be something far more greater, like suicidal tendencies, or even just schizophrenic behavior, anything like that. But like at some point, like it's a pretty common thing for mental unwellness to be a thing in America, because this is a very, again, it's not a country kind to mental health. And one of the reasons that is because people don't talk about the fact that they have mental health, because they don't want to be vilified. They see portrayals of like Joker portrayed by Joaquin Phoenix. They see all the rhetoric that happened with John Hinckley Jr. and being Taxi Driver, and it's like, oh, you don't want to be Travis Bickle. They see these stories of such unwell people as portrayed by the media, and it vilifies them. And it's just like, well, all these violent people are products of this, and thus we can't ask for mental health because we can't be associated with this. I am always going to defend an artist being able to show characters as they are and as they believe them. There is also a stereotype going around that is created by movies, and I'm not saying Scorsese has any blame of this, because I think Taxi Driver is exempt from this conversation, and I'll explain the difference in a second. But there is this behavior where we see movies that I would call irresponsible, because they're like, oh, well, this one small thing happens to you, and now you're a mentally unwell person, and now your mental health, it means you're a villain, and you're a bad person. And it's just like, well, mental health becomes the excuse for all villains. Thus, anyone with mental health becomes vilified. And that's where Taxi Driver exists, and that's kind of the issue with that. Or at least that's how Taxi Driver is then presented, when Taxi Driver is actually trying to explore the root causes of what makes Travis Bickle, which is everything that I just talked about: gun culture, coming home from Vietnam, etc., etc. I'm getting told that my disk space is almost full, so I'm going to wrap. So fun news, I got told that my computer is running out of disk space, and it just stopped my last stream, I should say. So that really is all I had to say about Scorsese, about Boxcar Bertha. Unusual episode, I will fully admit. Sorry, definitely a little under the weather. I think as the year goes on, I might actually try finding a guest to actually break down Boxcar Bertha with me so you get a proper episode. But regardless, I hope you enjoyed what I had to say. Ben Friedman here from Film School Dropout. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm about to pass out, so thank you all so much for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.